crystal hit marble like a gunshot. One bright, fragile sound, then a second, shards skittering across the floor, tiny bells of glass rolling under expensive shoes. The orchestra didn't stop, but the room did. A whole ballroom full of people in satin and tuxedos went silent in the way only the very rich can, as if quiet is something they own and can switch on with a glance. I stood there with a serving tray angled wrong in my hands, my stomach dropping so hard I thought I might throw up on the white tablecloths. My name badge suddenly felt like a target. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder than the chandelier's soft hum and the low, perfumed air of Manhattan money. And my daughter, my 7-year-old, my whole life was right there in the open. Lila's small body was planted beside the VIP table like she belonged there, like she hadn't just sprinted out from hiding and reached across a setting that probably cost more than my rent. 1 second earlier, a tall glass had been waiting by a place card at the head of the table, sparkling like it was meant for a photograph. The next second, it was on the floor, ruined, and everyone was staring at us like we'd smeared fingerprints on their mirrors. I felt the heat rise up my neck, sharp and humiliating. My supervisor's face flashed in my mind before I even turned my head. The tight mouth, the look that said I was one mistake away from being replaced. I didn't need to see him to know what he was thinking. I could already feel next week's schedule disappearing from my life. But that fear was nothing compared to the other one. The fear that the people who had eyes on that glass had eyes on my child now. I hadn't planned to bring Lila. I'd never planned something like that. I live on planning. I live on control. I live on the tiny invisible choices that keep a single mom afloat in a city that charges you for breathing. But that afternoon, my babysitter canceled. Last minute, like it was nothing. I had $24 in my wallet until payday. Not enough for a new sitter. Not enough for backup. Not enough for a choice. I'd stared at the bills on my counter, the rent reminder, the overdue electric notice, then stared at Lila's school bag by the door, and I'd made the only decision I could. I'd brought her with me. At the hotel, I'd walked through the service entrance where everything smelled like bleach and onions and hot metal, where the carpets were worn and the walls were scuffed by carts no one glamorous ever saw. I'd crouched beside her in a narrow alcove hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain, the kind that drank light and sound. I'd smoothed her braids with shaking fingers and pressed my forehead to hers like I could transfer my rules into her skin. I'd handed her a battered notebook and colored pencils, the same ones she carried everywhere, and I'd begged the universe to let her stay still for one shift. She had nodded like she understood. Lila always nods like she understands. Sometimes she understands too much. Now she was in front of Declan Cross. I didn't know his business. People like me never do. We just know the shape of power when it walks into a room. We know the way the air changes around certain men. Declan had that effect. Even from across the ballroom, you could feel him. Like a storm sealed inside a tailored suit. His table was set apart from everyone else's. Not with ropes or signs, but with space, empty space that nobody dared to fill. The place card with his name wasn't loud, but the whole room read it anyway. I saw his shoes first. Polished black leather, untouched by the champagne now soaking into the marble. I saw the cuff of his jacket, calm and still. And then I saw his face. He wasn't flinching. He wasn't scrambling back. He wasn't acting like a man who'd almost had a drink spilled on him by a child. He was watching. Not the glass. Not the mess. Not my supervisor edging closer like a shark smelling blood. He was watching Lila. My body finally obeyed me. I lunged forward, the tray wobbling, my knees almost slipping on the wet floor. I wanted to scoop her up, to hide her behind my ribs, to rewind time back behind that velvet curtain and lock the world out. Lila didn't look scared. Her eyes were wide, but not with childish panic, with focus, with urgency. Like she'd seen something in the air that none of us could see, like she'd heard meaning in silence. I knew that look. I'd seen it before, in quieter moments when strangers talked too fast, when foreign voices drifted in from a television in a diner, when her gaze followed mouths instead of faces. I'd tried to treat it like a quirk, like a trick, like something that wouldn't matter if I kept our lives small. But she hadn't knocked that glass down by accident. She had done it on purpose. And Declan Cross, the most dangerous man in the room, didn't look angry. He looked interested. I survived by staying invisible, and in one shattered second, I wasn't invisible anymore. After the glass shattered, my hands kept pretending to work. I bent to gather what I could with a napkin, like I could mop up disaster the way I mopped up spilled champagne. My supervisor hovered at my shoulder, and I could feel his anger without looking. The ballroom was loud again, but in my head everything stayed silent, like my ears had shut down to protect me. Lila's small fingers curled around my apron for 1 second, Then she let go, and I realized I was shaking, not from the cold marble under my knees, but from the same fear that has fed me for years. One mistake, and we fall. In Manhattan, invisibility is a skill, not a personality. I learned it the first year after Evan died, when grief and rent both showed up on the first of the month and neither cared what I felt. My rules are simple. Keep your head down. Say yes. Move fast. Smile like you mean it. Never draw a manager's attention, and never let a guest remember your face. Tonight I had $24 in my wallet, and I could already hear it dividing itself. $6 for a MetroCard refill, $8 for milk and cereal, $10 toward the electric bill that was 2 notices past polite. Every tip I imagined earning was already assigned to something that would keep Lila warm. When you live like this, you don't spend money. You pre-spend it in your mind, and you pray the world doesn't change the math. This gala was the kind of room built to make people like me disappear. Crystal chandeliers, white orchids, a wall of cameras catching charity smiles. Servers in black and white moved like quiet chess pieces, trained to never bump the board. The manager's eyes were always counting. Who spilled? Who slowed? Who looked tired enough to break? I'd watched coworkers vanish over smaller things than a broken glass. A tray tilted, a guest complained, a jacket brushed the wrong shoulder, and suddenly their badge didn't open the staff door anymore, so I kept my posture straight even when my feet screamed. I carried silver trays that felt heavier than my whole week. I laughed silently at jokes I couldn't afford, and I kept glancing toward the velvet curtain where I'd hidden my real life, praying nobody noticed the shape of a child-sized shadow behind it. I'd chosen that alcove because it was close enough for me to check on her between passes, and dark enough that a guest's wandering eyes would slide right over it. I'd tucked Lila behind the drape with her notebook and pencils, and I'd made her promise with her whole body, the way kids do when they want to be brave. The truth was, I wasn't brave. I was desperate. I hated myself for it every time I walked away and left her listening to the muffled music and the clink of glasses. I told myself it was temporary. Just until 2:30 a.m. when the last donor got their coat and I got my tip envelope. I told myself one night of hiding was better than a lifetime of not eating. Lila's gift is the reason I'm so careful, and also the reason careful never feels like enough. It started when she was 4, in a crowded pizza place in Queens. A family at the next table spoke rapid Spanish, and Lila, chewing her crust, suddenly answered them with a few perfect words. I remember my heart stopping, not from pride, but from the flash of attention that snapped toward her. After that, it kept happening. A Korean cashier, a French tourist lost on the subway. Lila would watch their mouths, tilt her head, and then repeat what they said like she'd been born to it. I took her to doctors because that's what you do when your child does something impossible. We sat in bright waiting rooms that smelled like hand sanitizer and crayons, and we filled out forms asking if she'd hit her head, if she'd had seizures, if she'd ever heard voices. The specialists used careful words and gave us smaller answers, maybe an unusual memory, maybe a rare kind of processing, maybe nothing to worry about. None of it matched what I saw at home, when she'd hear a language once on a cartoon and then understand it, like her mind had a secret door that never locked. So I stopped telling people. I stopped correcting strangers when they called her a little genius. I learned to smile and move on, because in this city, anything different becomes a spectacle, and a spectacle becomes a target. That's why, kneeling on that marble, I wanted to scoop her up and vanish through the staff corridor like smoke. But Declan's gaze held the air steady, and the room's elegance felt sharper, like a knife turned sideways. I guided Lila back toward the velvet drape, my body blocking her from wandering eyes, my mind begging the night to rewind. For a few steps she moved with me, obedient, small. Then she stopped, not stubbornly, not like a tired kid. She went still in a way that made my skin prickle, chin lifted, eyes locked past the curtain gap. It was the look she got when words in another language clicked into place. And whatever she'd caught just then felt hungry. From the floor level where servers live, the ballroom always looks like a chessboard. Tables are islands of linen and glass, and we move between them like pieces that must never collide. After the shatter, I felt every gaze still flickering toward me, even as laughter restarted. My supervisor's stare pressed between my shoulder blades. I forced my hand steady on the tray, breathed in orchids and expensive cologne, and searched for my curtain. Invisibility, I reminded myself, means you keep moving. You do not freeze. You do not become a story. Not here, not tonight, not with $24 left. That was when I noticed the 4 men enter together, perfectly timed with the next song change. They wore dark suits cut with the same precision, white shirts, identical knots at their throats. Their smiles were polite in the way a museum guard is polite, practiced, and empty. They paused just inside the doors as if sampling the room, then separated without speaking in English. One drifted toward the bar, one toward the stage, one toward the service corridor, and one toward the donors clustered near the auction tables. No one questioned them. In rooms like this, manners look harmless. I watched them the way I watch everyone with power, not out of curiosity but out of survival. Their eyes moved more than their heads. Their hands stayed too close to their jackets, fingers relaxed yet ready. When they laughed, their faces did not soften. When they bowed to a hostess, it looked rehearsed, like choreography. They never stood with their backs to an exit. They never stayed close enough to each other to seem like a group, yet their spacing felt measured, like points on a map. I had carried trays for celebrities, and these four scared me more. Across the room, Declan Cross took his place like a man arriving at his own courtroom. People made space without being asked. A banker with a silver laugh shifted his chair. A woman in diamonds stepped back half a step, eyes lowered. Declan did not waste movement. He sat, but his attention stayed standing. His gaze swept exits, balconies, the staff door, the security guards pretending to be decor. He looked for angles the way other men look for compliments. Even from my distance, I could feel he carried danger as habit, not costume. Like he had studied danger daily. My own job was simpler. Keep the night smooth, keep the guests fed, keep my supervisor calm. I slid through bodies with a tray of sparkling water, apologizing with my posture. Every time I passed a table, I did the quick math of what a generous tip could cover. A folded bill might mean new shoes for Lila. An empty glass might mean nothing at all. And after the broken drink, I felt my margin shrinking. I could already picture my supervisor writing my name on a list, the list that ends with unemployment. In this city, you fall quietly. Between rounds, I stole a glance toward the velvet curtain. Behind it, the alcove was dim, smelling faintly of linen carts and lemon cleaner. Lila sat on the floor with her notebook open, but she was not coloring. Her pencil hovered as if she had forgotten what drawing was. She watched through a narrow gap where the drape didn't meet the wall, eyes tracking mouths instead of faces. That was the part of her gift that always unsettled me. It wasn't just hearing, it was seeing language, catching it like a net. I had taught her to hide that talent. The four Japanese men drifted near her line of sight, and I saw Lila's shoulders tense. Her gaze snapped from one to another, following their lips as they spoke softly when they thought no one listened. I could not hear the words over the clatter of plates, but I recognized the pattern. Her eyes narrowing, her mouth forming silent echoes. She did that when she was translating in her head. A moment later, she looked at the head table, at Declan's place setting, and her face went pale in a way children cannot fake, like she read danger on it. I didn't understand Japanese, but I understood my child. Lila's fingers gripped the pencil until her knuckles blanched. Her lips moved with no sound, repeating what she saw. Later, I would piece it together from the way she stared at one glass and not the others, from the way her eyes flicked to a bottle being presented like a gift. Reserved glass, her expression said. Special vintage, her rigid spine insisted. And then she swallowed hard, as if tasting metal. 20 minutes. Her fear translated, like a countdown that had already started ticking under the music. My stomach dropped again. The men spread farther apart, and the room didn't notice. That is the trick of predators in a crowd. They look like guests, until they don't. One took a slow circuit behind the dessert station, watching the service doors. Another leaned near the sommelier, pointing with a gracious hand at bottles on display. The third hovered close to the auction stage, as if waiting for a cue. The fourth remained nearest Declan's table, smiling at anyone who looked his way. A net, invisible as mine, tightening thread by thread. I kept working, but my eyes kept counting risks around us. My supervisor flicked his chin toward the head table, the silent order every server understands. I adjusted my apron, lifted a plate that smelled of butter and sea salt, and walked the long path toward Declan Cross. Each step felt like walking into a spotlight. I could feel Lila behind the curtain, could feel her attention tugging at me like a thread. As I neared the VIP place settings, I saw one of the Japanese men offer a bottle to the head server, bowing with perfect grace. The bottle gleamed as if it mattered. Declan watched that exchange without blinking. I set the plate down with hands that refused to stop trembling, and I felt the room narrow to one detail, the glass waiting by Declan's right hand. It was the same kind of sparkle that had already ruined my night, only now it looked like a trap. I glanced toward the curtain, expecting to see Lila's small face peeking out. Instead, I saw the drape shift, then empty space. My breath caught. A second later, Lila's copper braids appeared between strangers' knees, weaving through gowns and tuxedos, running straight toward the VIP table, and I knew these decided everything. I saw Lila before anyone else did, a small flash of copper braids cutting through black suits and glittering gowns. My tray felt welded to my palms, my feet stuck to the carpet, because the VIP table was only a few steps away and the glass beside Declan Cross was already waiting. Everything in me screamed to stay invisible, to obey my supervisor, to pretend my child did not exist. Then Lila slipped between two donors, shoulders squared like a tiny soldier, and I understood she was not running to me. She was running to stop something before it happened. The head server leaned in with a bottle presented like a treasure, and the liquid in the crystal caught chandelier light like poisoned gold. I had time to notice the rim, the condensation, the way the place setting was arranged with military precision. Lila reached the table edge, rose on her toes, and her hand shot out. She did not hesitate. The glass flew, tipped, and crashed onto marble with a sharp, clean crack. A wave of drink splashed across linen and polished shoes. The sound sliced through music, and the ballroom fell into a stunned, hostile hush at once. For a heartbeat, every face turned toward us with the same expression. Annoyance first, then curiosity, then judgment. I felt myself shrinking inside my uniform, the way I always did when rich people noticed I was human. My supervisor's presence hit me like a slap, and I pictured him cutting my shifts, erasing my name, sending me back to the subway with $24 and an empty fridge. Guests leaned away as if our mistake could stain them. A security guard near the wall shifted his stance. My throat tightened, and my only thought was to grab Lila and disappear tonight. Except Lila's eyes were locked on Declan's place setting, not on me, and that difference mattered. Her face held an urgency that didn't belong to a second grader. I bent close, shielding her with my body, and I caught the faintest rush of breath from her, like a secret pressed into my apron. I didn't hear Japanese, but I recognized the way her mind translated. Reserved glass, special vintage. The words landed in my gut as if they were mine. Then came the number, 20 minutes, and I understood she had just read a death sentence off someone's lips nearby. Declan Cross didn't explode. He didn't even rise. He simply looked down at the marble by his shoes, then up at my daughter, then past both of us into the room like he was tracing invisible lines. His calm was colder than anger. I watched his gaze skip from the bottle to the four polite men, and I saw recognition flicker, quick and sharp. Without words, he moved one hand in a small, precise motion, the kind leaders make when they want something handled. Around the perimeter, men with earpieces straightened, drifting closer as if they belonged there all along. The shift was so subtle most guests missed it. One of Declan's men slid behind the head server and guided his hands away from the bottle with a courteous touch. Another stepped between the nearest Japanese man and the table, smiling the way bouncers smile when they're done asking. At the far side of the room, two more men closed the distance to the others, their bodies angled like doors shutting. The four visitors kept their polite masks, but their eyes darted, measuring exits, counting allies. The bottle disappeared into a case, treated as evidence, not a gift for testing. I finally moved, lunging toward Lila with a desperation that made my knees buckle. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, checking her for cuts, for tears, for the kind of damage you can't undo. My mind flashed through worst outcomes. Security hauling us out, police, a lifetime of being the woman who ruined a gala. But Lila's body stayed steady against mine. She wasn't crying. She was pointing with her eyes, tracking the men, tracking the bottle, tracking Declan's face like she needed him to understand. In that moment, I hated every adult in the room for doubting her. Her breath brushed my wrist, and I caught fragments the way you catch a child's nightmare in the dark. She had read their lips, heard Japanese once, and kept it forever. She had understood a plan no kid should carry. One glass set aside, one bottle offered as a favor. The promise that after he drank, there would be 20 minutes before anyone noticed. My stomach turned as I imagined Declan collapsing at the table, while the room applauded itself. I stared at the spill pooling on marble and felt like I was looking into a hole in the world. Declan's attention returned to us with a weight that made my lungs feel smaller. He studied Lila's face the way he had studied the exits, searching for truth, for tricks, for leverage. I could tell he wanted to know how my child could decode Japanese across a ballroom. I could also tell he believed her. That belief was frightening in its way. I tightened my hold, ready to apologize, ready to fight if I had to. Lila looked back without flinching, like she recognized something tired and dangerous in him. I felt the room waiting for him to decide fate. My supervisor moved in, already shaping an apology that would have cost me my job. I saw it in his tight smile, in the way he aimed my failure at the head table like an offering. Declan stopped him with a single lifted hand. Without raising his voice, Declan made it obvious there would be no complaint and no termination. He turned the broken glass into grace instead of offense. Then, for everyone to hear, he declared that Lila and I would stay as his personal guests for the rest of the evening. Guests sounded flattering. It felt like custody. As if on cue, the orchestra swelled, and conversations restarted in embarrassed bursts. People smiled brightly, eager to pretend they hadn't watched a life almost end. But I saw the other truth. The 4 Japanese men were no longer free to roam. Declan's security folded around them, guiding them toward a service exit with the same politeness the men had worn all night. No one made a scene. No one screamed. It was cleaner than that. I kept Lila against my side and noticed a shadow at my shoulder. An earpiece. A gaze. Protection, I realized, can look like surveillance. Declan's calm never left his face, but his attention stayed on us like a hand on my neck. I felt my supervisor retreat, and the room decide we were no longer background. Lila blinked, the spell of focus loosening, and pressed closer as if she'd just realized what she'd done. I wanted to hide her and beg her to never scare me again. Instead, I stayed still, because cameras were turning and strangers were listening. Declan's men hovered near, guards in suits. The danger had paused, not ended, and I couldn't shake the thought that my name was already traveling. Within seconds, the orchestra found its rhythm again, and the room pretended nothing had happened. Laughter returned in careful waves, champagne refilled, forks tapped plates, and donors leaned closer to be heard over the music. I stood beside the VIP table with my pulse still sprinting, holding Lila against my hip like she might evaporate if I loosened my arm. The marble was already wiped clean, as if the shattered glass had been a stage trick. That normality felt cruel. My cheeks burned. My supervisor hovered, waiting for permission to punish me. Above us, chandeliers glittered, indifferent, like cold stars. Declan's people moved the way my coworkers moved, only faster and with purpose that didn't require talking. A man with an earpiece drifted to my left, blocking the line of sight from the ballroom. Another bent near the head server, and the gifted bottle vanished into a dark case as if it had never been offered. Across the room, the 4 Japanese men were surrounded by bodies that looked like guests until you noticed their shoes all faced the exits. Smiles stayed polite, hands stayed low, yet every pathway narrowed, quietly, like doors closing in a hallway for us too. All I wanted was to carry Lila back behind the velvet curtain, erase her from the cameras, and return to being the help no one remembers. But Declan's attention kept landing on her like a spotlight, and the men around him watched her with the same measuring calm. It made my skin crawl. Lila wasn't a tool. She was a kid who still forgot to tie her shoes. I felt rage flare at the thought of anyone deciding her value. Around us, guests sipped and smiled, already rewriting the moment into gossip that wouldn't touch their lives by midnight tomorrow. My supervisor edged closer, the tight set of his mouth promising consequences, and I could almost feel my schedule being crossed out. I'd seen it happen. One complaint, one spill, and a mother's paycheck turns into a polite email about standards. I braced for it, stomach hollow. But then Declan shifted his gaze to the man, and the entire hotel hierarchy folded. It wasn't loud. It was worse. My supervisor's shoulders dipped. His anger rerouted into fear, and he backed away like he'd been reminded who owned this room. Power erased my mistake in public and trapped me in private. Lila's breathing stayed steady, even as my heart tried to climb out of my chest. Her eyes kept moving, not wandering, but tracking. She looked past VIP table toward the eastern exit, and her face tightened the way it did when she was translating. Then she shifted toward the kitchen doors, watching a man in a server jacket who didn't move like staff. I didn't need words to understand her meaning. She was telling me the plot had hands. The 4 polite men were only the front. Somewhere in the crowd, others were waiting to see whether the plan worked. I felt anger rise, hot and bitter, because I knew how this story usually ends for people like me. The wealthy would applaud Declan's composure, praise the hotel for handling a disturbance, and forget my name before dessert. Meanwhile, I would be the employee who brought a child to work, the woman who disrupted a donor's evening, the risk on a manager's spreadsheet. Doing the right thing never pays my rent. It only makes me visible. I held Lila tighter and wished I could explain to the room that she had just saved a life, not ruined a party tonight. Declan's protection wrapped around us like velvet, soft to the crowd and suffocating to me. His security never touched us, yet they stayed close enough that I could feel their intent, guiding where we stood, where we walked, when we breathed. I hated how quickly my world rearranged around one man's decision. Part of me wanted to refuse, to sprint back to the service corridor and pretend we could go home and lock the door. Another part knew that door was made of cardboard against people who could poison a glass in public. I hated needing him most of all. Lila tugged lightly at my sleeve, then pointed with her chin, the way she did when she didn't want to be seen. Her gaze flicked to two men near the service doors, then to the far bar where a woman held a phone too low and spoke without sound. Lila's lips moved, silently repeating what she read, and I caught one name in the shape of her mouth, a hard rhythm she'd never learned at school. Tanaka. The syllables chilled me. Declan's eyes followed her line of sight, and his expression tightened for the first time. He believed her warning. The Gala kept sparkling, but the room felt compromised, like a beautiful house with termites in the beams. I watched Declan's men rotate positions, trading places with the ease of people trained to be invisible in a different way. One checked the service hallway, another scanned the balcony, another shadowed me as if I were evidence too. I kept thinking about our apartment, the hallway that smelled like cooking, the lock I'd trusted because it was all I had. If tonight's plot could reach into a Gala, it could reach into my building. The idea made my mouth go dry. An earpiece crackled near my shoulder, but I caught the change in the guard's posture. He leaned toward Declan, and Declan's gaze snapped to me like a hook. I didn't hear the words, yet the meaning traveled through their faces. Something had moved beyond this room. Records, names, addresses. My stomach rolled as I imagined a stranger scrolling through a database, landing on Maya Carter, and finding the street where Lila slept. Declan's jaw tightened, and his security chief gestured toward a side corridor. I understood then. My home was breached, and the night was about to swallow us whole. They moved us through a side door that smelled of polished brass and lemon disinfectant, away from the ballroom's music and cameras. Two men in dark suits flanked me, not touching, but close enough that I felt guided like a cart on rails. Lila held my hand, warm and steady, while my feet ached inside cheap shoes. We passed a service corridor, then a private elevator with no buttons, just a panel that recognized one fingerprint. When the doors closed, the city noise vanished, and the ride upward felt like sinking into a velvet box I had not chosen yet. The penthouse opened into silence so thick it made me whisper in my own head. Plush carpet swallowed footsteps. Art hung on walls like quiet warnings, each piece priceless enough to buy years of groceries. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Manhattan glittering over the river, a skyline that looked close enough to touch yet impossibly far from my life. A kitchen island shone like a mirror. A vase of white orchids matched the Gala, as if the same world continued here. I kept scanning for locks, cameras, exits, because beauty can be a cage and I could feel the bars and kindness. A woman in black moved through the room without a sound, setting down water and folded towels, never meeting my eyes. Another staff member appeared with a first aid kit for the cut I did not have, as if they prepared for every version of panic. My uniform suddenly seemed louder than any siren. I imagined lint on my sleeves, the sore bend of my back, the smell of seafood still clinging to my hands. Lila stared at the view, then at the ceiling corners, cataloging vents and sensors with the calm of someone solving a puzzle as I fought breathing. Declan stood near a wall of screens, jacket off, sleeves rolled with the same control he wore at the Gala. A man placed a tablet in his hand, and Declan's eyes flicked over it once, then twice, like a verdict. I didn't need to read the report to understand the gravity in his face. The drink had been tested. It carried a toxin designed to leave no story behind, the kind that makes a body look like it simply gave up. Natural heart failure, packaged as chance. If Lila had stayed hidden, the crowd would applaud and call it tragedy. He didn't look relieved. He looked sharpened. His calm wasn't comfort. It was readiness, like a man who has rehearsed betrayal for years. I caught the name Tanaka again, in the way his security chief's mouth formed it, and Declan's jaw tightened as if the syllables tasted bitter. He turned his gaze on me, then on Lila, weighing us the way my supervisor weighed a tray, except the cost here was life. I knew I had a child and no cover left at all. Lila sat on a sofa that could fit my whole kitchen, swinging her feet like she was waiting for a school bus. She wasn't fearless. She was focused. Her eyes drifted to the books lining the walls, to the languages on their spines, to the monitors that showed the building's entrances. She read the room the way other kids read cartoons. I hated that it came so naturally to her. I brushed her hair back and checked her hands, searching for glass, but she squeezed my fingers as if she were the parent, and for a moment my throat went tight. Declan knelt in front of her, not like a friendly uncle, but like an interrogator who doesn't need to raise his voice. He watched her mouth, her eyes, the way she tracked soundless conversations on screens. I could sense him testing the edges of her ability, deciding whether it was miracle or weapon. In his world, information was currency, and a child who could decode strangers was both priceless and unsafe. I felt gratitude that he had walls and guards, and disgust that my gratitude depended on him. That is what power does. It saves you, then names the price. A guest restroom in that place looked like a spa, but I couldn't relax enough to wash my hands. Every door required a code or a fingerprint. Every hallway had a camera lens tucked into crown molding. When I stepped to the window, the glass was thick, double-layered, built for storms and bullets. I refused to imagine. Below, the city kept living. Taxis sliding through light. People free to go home to ordinary problems. I realized I couldn't. Leaving wasn't an option I could negotiate. Protection had turned into confinement, and the cage was lined in silk around my child. A muted alarm pulsed from the wall of screens, more vibration than sound. On the central feed, the lobby doors slid open, and a cluster of uniformed officers stepped inside, faces stern, hands near belts. They moved with confidence, flashing badges at the front desk, and the concierge's posture shifted into nervous obedience. For a moment, my heart unclenched, because uniforms mean help to people who still believe in help. Then Lila leaned forward, eyes narrowing, studying their mouths on the grainy video. Her small hand gripped my wrist like a warning. I feel her mind clicking into place again. She didn't look at their badges. She watched their lips, and I watched her face drain of color. The tallest one spoke English to the desk, but his jaw slipped into Japanese the second he turned toward his team. Lila's eyes flicked to Declan, and I knew she'd caught words like extraction and upstairs, the kind that don't belong in a routine visit. Declan's body went still, predatory calm returning like a blade sliding free. Men in his penthouse shifted positions, doors locking, weapons hidden but ready. I understood then. The law was a mask, and we had to move now. The moment I understood the uniforms in the lobby were a costume, the penthouse stopped feeling soft. It became a glass box balanced on the sky. Declan's wall of screens showed the fake officers pressing for access, their mouths shaping Japanese whenever they turned away from the concierge. Lila's grip tightened on my wrist, and I felt my own fear harden into something useful. I pulled her close, pressing my palm to the back of her head, breathing in shampoo and hotel air. Somewhere below, an elevator chimed. Above us, recessed lights stayed warm, stubbornly calm. That contrast made me furious. I didn't run for me. I ran because a child's hand in mine is a promise, and promises don't get to panic. I watched Declan's men shift as shadows, and waited for him to choose the exit he'd built. Security didn't shout. They didn't need to. A man at the door slid a latch I hadn't noticed, and another tapped a code that turned the hallway locks into a single system. Curtains that had looked decorative dropped over windows, thicker than theater velvet. Someone killed the music. The city view remained, but it was framed now by reinforced glass and reflected by monitors showing stairwells, elevators, and rooftop access. Declan moved through the room like he'd done it 100 times, pointing once, then twice, and the air rearranged itself around those gestures. 2 guards took positions near me and Lila, not blocking us, just making it impossible for anyone else to reach us first. I caught glimpses of their earpieces, the subtle nods, the way their shoes angled toward the same line as if the floor had arrows. Declan's eyes stayed on the lobby feed. The imposters had that confident patience of men who expected doors to open for them. I imagined them riding the public elevator, badges flashing, guns hidden under uniforms, and my stomach tried to fold in half. Declan crossed to a bookshelf that looked like art and money, pressed his hand against a carved panel, and found a seam. It wasn't magic. It was engineering. The wood shifted with a soft sigh, revealing a narrow passage lit in dim amber. Cool concrete breathed out, smelling like rain and dust. Lila leaned forward, curious, while I tightened my grip, because curiosity can get a child killed. He ushered us in with one sharp motion, and his security flowed behind us, sealing the panel as we passed. The living room vanished, replaced by a utility hush. The passage narrowed into a private service spine of the building, the kind no guest ever learns exists. My world shrank to Lila's fingers in mine, her small breath, the soft slap of her sneakers against concrete. Behind us, the panel closed, and with it my last illusion of choice. Ahead, a silent lift waited, metal walls cold enough to raise goosebumps through my uniform. Declan keyed it with speed, then stood between us and the corridor like a human door. I didn't trust him, not really, but I trusted the way he listened, head angled, eyes distant, measuring footsteps that I couldn't hear yet. Somewhere above, I imagined the fake police finding the right elevator bank and smiling at their own luck. I kept my face blank for Lila. My heart beat, but my hands stayed guiding her like a compass. The lift dropped us into a lower level that smelled of oil and fresh paint. Emergency lights cast everything in a tired yellow. Declan's men fanned out, checking corners, watching the cameras on a handheld screen, their movements economical, almost bored. That terrified me most. It meant this wasn't new. A heavy door opened into a garage that didn't look like a garage, more like a private runway for black SUVs. Engines idled without sound. Ready. I hustled Lila forward, keeping my body between her and every unknown shadow. Overhead, a faint thump echoed doors upstairs being tested, maybe forced, maybe simply knocked. Lila's eyes flicked to the security feed in a guard's palm, and she inhaled fast, recognizing the rhythm of Japanese mouths even in grainy video. Declan touched my elbow, guiding direction, and I hated that I followed anyway. We moved as a tight cluster. A rear door opened, and I climbed in with Lila first, pulling her onto the seat beside me. Leather smelled like money and gun oil. Declan slid in across from us, not close enough to touch, close enough to block the view. The vehicle rolled before the door had fully shut, tires whispering over polished concrete. I stared at my daughter's face, trying to memorize the shape of her calm, because my own calm was gone. I wanted to demand answers, to ask why us, why tonight, why a child. Instead, I counted breaths and listened for sirens that might belong to the wrong side. Above, in the invisible floors we'd left, I pictured imposters in uniforms climbing, finding empty rooms, and realizing their prey had slipped through walls. My stomach twisted at that. The city outside looked normal through tinted glass. Late-night traffic, neon reflections, people laughing on sidewalks. Normality felt like an insult. Lila turned her head slightly, listening, watching Declan the way she watched everyone when language hid behind manners. Her eyes traced his jaw as he spoke briefly into a phone, then returned to me with a look that was too careful. I felt it like a change in temperature. She wasn't translating Japanese now. She was deciding whether to tell me something. Her small hand slid into mine again, and for the first time since the gala, her fingers trembled. I leaned closer, shielding her with my shoulder, and she angled her chin toward Declan's briefcase on the seat beside him. The case looked ordinary, but Lila's gaze said it wasn't. In her mind, she had opened it already. She couldn't keep it in. Her lips moved, and I didn't need sound to understand. Earlier, before the lobby alarm, she had seen Declan reading pages with my name, photos, Toomey on a sidewalk, Lila at a school gate, snapshots taken from far away. The words landed like ice water. For a second I forgot the imposters, forgot Tanaka, forgot the night. I saw only a man who owned a penthouse and a private army, and who had been watching us long before my daughter saved his life. Betrayal tasted sharp, like biting foil. I gripped Lila's hand so hard she winced, and then I forced my fingers to loosen, because she had done nothing wrong. Across from me, Declan's expression didn't change, but I felt the space between us fill with secrets. The gala, suddenly, didn't feel accidental anymore. The SUV kept moving, and I held anger behind my teeth. Tanaka's men hunted us, but Declan had chosen us first. At the safe house, I would demand truth tonight. By the time the SUV left the city lights behind, the air changed. Hudson Valley smelled like wet leaves and pine, and the road narrowed into darkness lit by our headlights. A gate appeared, then another, and armed men stepped out of the trees like they'd been planted there. They checked the undercarriage with mirrors, scanned Declan's face, then waved us through. The house beyond looked like a magazine dreamstone. Glass, warm windows, yet the perimeter lights and silent cameras made it feel like a bunker wearing perfume. I hugged Lila tighter, telling myself safety shouldn't need this many locks tonight. Inside, heat wrapped around us, smelling of clean linen and coffee that had been waiting. My shoes sank into a rug thicker than my daughter's comforter. A man took my coat I didn't own, because I had none, and still he moved as if I was a guest. Lila looked up at the ceiling corners, tracking vents and tiny red dots that weren't decor. I kept my hands on her shoulders, counting exits the way Declan did, even while my eyes betrayed me with awe at the skyline-free quiet and the space to breathe until my thoughts snapped back hard. They gave us a bedroom larger than my apartment's living room, but I couldn't sit. I paced, listening to the house breathe through its vents, to guards murmuring outside the door. Lila climbed onto a window seat and watched the driveway like it was a storybook. When I went looking for a bathroom, I found a study with a desk lit by a single lamp. A folder lay open, and my own face stared back at me from glossy surveillance photos. Me pushing Lila's stroller. Me unlocking our building. Me crying on a subway platform dated labeled clipped like evidence. My stomach turned the way it does right before a bad fall. I touched the edge of one photo as if it could bite me. This wasn't protection. It was possession. Footsteps sounded behind me, and I didn't need to turn to know Declan had entered, because the room tightened around his presence. I held up the file with shaking hands, and the meaning of his silence landed harder than any confession. He had known my routines, my address, my daughter's school gate. Tonight wasn't the first time he'd watched us breathe. I felt my pride rip, thread by thread. What came next didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a fact he'd carried too long. Evan Carter, my Evan, had worked for a legitimate investment firm that was only half true. Behind the polished office and payroll stubs, he had balanced books for Declan's organization, mapping money the way some men map streets. Declan's war with Tanaka had made accountants as valuable as soldiers. Evan's car wreck 5 years ago suddenly rearranged itself in my memory. The closed casket, the vague police report, the way questions were answered too quickly, as if truth was swept aside for convenience. I saw Evan in our kitchen, stirring cheap pasta, humming off-key while Lila colored at the table. I saw his hands fixing a leaking faucet, his patience when I snapped from exhaustion, his sleepy forehead kiss before he left for work. Those memories were so ordinary they hurt. Now another image forced itself beside them. Evan in a suit I never saw, walking into a building he called a client meeting, carrying numbers that could get him killed. I wanted to scream that he was just mine, but grief doesn't negotiate with new information. It only opens, and it floods. Declan's file held more than photos. There were notes about our landlord, about a scholarship fund, about a hospital bill from Lila's pneumonia year that I'd never understood how I paid. I remembered the rent that never rose with the neighborhood, the anonymous grocery gift cards at Christmas, the sudden approval for after-school care when the waiting list was supposed to be months. I had called it luck, then hard work, then mercy. It was none of those. It was a ledger entry in someone else's promise, paid quietly because Evan had saved Declan once and Declan refused to forget. I should have felt grateful, and some small part of me did, the part that remembers cold nights and empty cupboards. But gratitude curdled fast when I realized I had been managed like a risk. My pride had been my last possession. I'd believed I kept us alive by working double shifts and learning every subway shortcut. Now I pictured invisible hands steadying the railing so I wouldn't fall, then claiming credit for my balance. The worst part was how familiar it felt. Evan had been keeping secrets for protection, and Declan had honored them by lying to my face. Lila sat cross-legged on the bed, listening not just to words but to the tremor underneath them. She watched Declan's face when Evan's name surfaced, and she watched mine when my anger tried to turn into denial. Her calm wasn't childish bravery. It was pattern recognition. She could see which guards were afraid, which were loyal, which were pretending. When she leaned into me, it wasn't for comfort alone. It was as if she was anchoring me to the truth so I couldn't float away. I held her and felt both pride and terror sharpen into the same blade tonight. The surveillance stopped feeling random once the shape of the promise appeared. Evan had asked Declan to keep us fed and unseen, to hold us up without pulling us into his war. Declan had obeyed, in the only language his world respects, obligation. The file wasn't romance or curiosity. It was a watchman's log. He'd tracked our routines so his help stayed invisible, so Tanaka's people wouldn't find the same addresses his men knew. That explanation didn't soften the violation. It sharpened it, because it meant my life had been planned like a security detail, not lived like a choice. I went to the window and looked out at the dark hills, trying to find the version of myself who believed she did it alone. I had worn that belief like armor. Single mom, self-made, no help, no favors. It was the story that let me keep my head up on the subway and in the break room. Now I understood the armor had been lent, polished by someone else's hands. That didn't feel like rescue. It felt like theft. Someone had decided my agency was negotiable, and they never asked. Even Evan had taken my right to know too. Lila finally fell asleep, thumb tucked under her chin, and I sat beside her listening to the house's layers. The soft whir of heaters, the distant click of boots on gravel, the low radio murmur outside. Declan's people kept watch in shifts, their silhouettes passing windows like moving curtains. No one celebrated the saved life. No one acted relieved. That silence told me Tanaka hadn't lost. He had paused. Predators go quiet when they change tactics. Somewhere, men were regrouping, checking lists, making plans. And now my name belonged on their list. Not because of Declan, but because of Evan. Before dawn, when the coffee tasted burnt and the sky stayed black, I admitted what I'd avoided for years. My survival hadn't been solo. Declan's debt, Evan's secrets, Lila's gift, all of it had built a hidden scaffold under our life. It kept us from breaking, but it also kept us from being free. I stared at my hands and wondered how many choices were truly mine. Outside, guards paced quiet circles, and the valley held its breath. I didn't feel safe. I felt selected, and I sensed Tanaka's silence was only the inhale before a strike aimed at us. Silence in the valley was never empty. It had weight. At dawn, the safe house looked peaceful, stone warmed by weak sun, trees dripping last night's rain. But the radios on the counters stayed quiet too long, and the guards spoke with their eyes instead of their mouths. I had learned in Manhattan that noise means people, and quiet means someone is listening. Tanaka's name hadn't surfaced on any feed since midnight, and that absence felt like a held breath. I kept Lila close, watching her draw circles on fogged glass, pretending normal while my skin waited for the moment when the world showed teeth. After breakfast that no one tasted, shift change came early. 2 men walked the fence line with flashlights, even though daylight held, sweeping the tree line as if it could answer back. A dog from a neighboring farm barked once, then went silent, staring into the woods like it saw a door. My phone searched for signal, found 1 bar, then dropped to nothing. In the kitchen, a security monitor flickered, then steadied, and a guard's hand hovered near his earpiece. Lila stopped humming. She tilted her head, listening to the absence between sounds. I felt the floor vibrate, as if engines circled our driveway. The first alert wasn't a siren. It was a soft chime on the wall panel, the kind meant to avoid panic. On the monitors, green perimeter lines flashed to amber in 3 places at once: the west gate, the rear orchard, and the boathouse path that led down to the river. Dark shapes moved low and fast, not stumbling like trespassers, but advancing like they had rehearsed the angles. Declan appeared in the doorway, already dressed, already keyed into the feeds. His people snapped into motion, and the house's beauty folded inward, shutters sliding down over glass. I grabbed Lila's hand before mine caught up. No one shouted. Orders traveled through gestures and earpiece taps. A guard turned the hallway lights off, leaving only low-floor strips that guided feet without announcing them. Steel pins slid into door frames with small clicks, and the scent of oil rose as hidden panels unlocked. Through a narrow window slit, I saw figures at the orchard drop something onto the grass, then slip through a gap in the fence. The timing was too neat. Declan's men mirrored them, taking angles, protecting stairwells, sealing the main entrance as if the attackers were reading the same manual. My chest tightened, because manual had our names inside. They moved us fast, not running, but flowing down a corridor behind a rotating bookshelf. Lila didn't ask questions. She just stayed close. Small fingers locked to mine. The panic room was a concrete chamber hidden in the house's core, lined with filtered vents and a humming backup generator. When the heavy door sealed, the sound was final, like a vault closing on air. I hated how safe it felt. Screens filled one wall, showing every approach in night vision green. I pressed Lila's head to my shoulder and tried to breathe without tasting fear. Outside, the house became a battlefield, and we became buried witnesses. Lila climbed onto the chair in front of the monitors like she belonged there. Her eyes flicked from camera to camera, counting bodies with the calm of math homework. She mouthed numbers, then held up fingers for me. 27. I swallowed hard. She pointed to a man near the west gate. Neck tilted so the camera caught a dark tattoo curling under his collar, and her face tightened at the way his mouth shaped commands. It wasn't the Japanese she heard at the Gala. It was rougher, regional, meant for soldiers. Declan watched her like she was a screen, and I felt pride collide inside. On another feed, 2 intruders approached the side door using the same staggered pattern Declan's guards used on patrol, one moving while the other covered. They avoided the motion sensors with a timing that made my stomach clench. Declan's expression changed then. Not to fear, but to offense, as if someone had stolen his playbook. I understood without hearing the words. These weren't amateurs, and they knew the house. A leak, a traitor, a paid silence. The thought made the panic room feel smaller, as if betrayal was a gas filling it. Leela kept counting, and every number felt like another nail in our door. A panel in the wall slid open, and Declan pulled out a map case and a keyring that looked older than the house. He traced a route under the property with his finger, then glanced at me as if deciding how much truth I could carry. I caught the name Evan in his mouth, and it hit like fresh grief. The tunnel, he implied, wasn't Declan's idea. It had been insisted on years ago, designed for a siege exactly like this. My husband, the quiet man who paid bills on time, had planned escape lines. Suddenly, the word accountant felt too small for him tonight. The monitors showed the orchard team reaching the house, shadows pressed to stone. A dull thud echoed above us, and dust shivered from the ceiling seam. Declan's men tightened their grips, but no one fired in my sight. They held the line with silence and steel. Declan guided us to a second hidden door inside the panic room, a rectangle I had mistaken for plain wall. He turned the old key, and the slab swung inward, releasing damp air and the smell of earth. Steps descended into darkness. I lifted Lila into my arms, and my knees shook, but I forced voice to stay steady. Behind us, the panic room door sealed again, and the sound was like a tombstone sliding into place. Ahead, the tunnel walls were concrete, tagged with old paint marks, lit by small emergency bulbs that threw long shadows. Water dripped somewhere deeper, a steady metronome for our fear. Lila clung to my neck, whispering breath against my ear without words, and I moved one step at a time, trusting Declan because there was no other hand on the map. Above, another heavy impact rolled through the floor. I prayed the tunnel would lead to open sky, not another trap, before morning found us out there. Cold air hit us the second the tunnel let go of us. The river smelled like metal in winter, and the dockboards were slick under my shoes. Declan's men peeled away into darkness while he guided us to a low speedboat tucked beneath reeds and shadow. I climbed in first, hauling Leela onto my lap, then tucking a blanket around us as the engine woke. Above, the sky was ink. Trees watched, silent still. We shot out from the hidden cut in the bank, the hull slapping black water hard enough to rattle my teeth. Fog rolled low, swallowing the shoreline in strips, and Manhattan's lights became a smeared necklace behind us. Lila's hair stuck to her cheek from spray. I kept my arms locked around her ribs, feeling every vibration of the motor through my bones, fighting the urge to throw up and praying hands would not slip. Declan sat at the controls like the boat was an extension of his spine, shoulders steady, eyes scanning the fog for shapes I couldn't name. He didn't glance back to check if I was okay, and somehow that honesty calmed me more than comfort would have. I hated needing him. I hated that his world came with tunnels and guns and plans, yet his hands never shook, like he'd memorized every way tonight could end. In the roar of the engine, my mind did what it always does when it's cornered. It bargained. Not with God exactly, just with whatever invisible math runs the universe. I promised I would give up sleep, pride, even my last name if Lila could see sunrise. I replayed every time I snapped at her from exhaustion and begged forgiveness in silence. Her small heartbeat against my arm was the only answer. I listened anyway. At first I thought the extra vibration was my own fear, but the river carries sound like a rumor. A second engine note threaded into the night, higher pitched, closing. Behind us, two pale cones of light bled through fog, then vanished, then returned farther to the right, testing angles. Declan adjusted course without hesitation, cutting across a darker stretch where the water narrowed between industrial pilings. I felt wake change, sharp as a knife. Leela lifted her head from my shoulder and went still, the way she did when she was listening to language without sound. Her eyes fixed behind us, then to the side. Even through fog, she could read mouths when the boats drifted close enough, and her face tightened at what she caught. I didn't understand Japanese, but I understood her meaning. 2 boats, one flanking, one racing ahead to choke us on their planned timeline. Declan didn't argue with a child's warning. He watched Lila's eyes like a compass needle, and turned hard left into a channel I would have missed, its mouth hidden by derelict barges and a sagging pier. The boat leaned, spraying cold needles across my face. Lila squeaked, then steadied, and I tucked her deeper under the blanket. The pursuer's lights swung wide, slower, struggling to follow our tighter curve. Fog swallowed them, but engines stayed near. Something struck the water behind us with a sharp slap, not close enough to hit, close enough to make me imagine what could. The fog flashed with a brief spark, then darkness again. Declan pushed the throttle, and the boat's vibration climbed into my jaw. I kept my cheek against Lila's hair, counting her breaths. She didn't cry. She listened, tracking the rhythm of pursuit, like it was a drumbeat only she could hear tonight. For a few seconds, the river opened into a wider stretch, and the city looked like a postcard someone else owned. Neon reflected on black water, shaking with each wave. I wondered if anyone at the gala was eating dessert, laughing about the broken glass, unaware we were out here racing for our lives. I wanted to hate them, but hatred takes energy I needed for Lila. I focused on her warmth, on staying present. Lila's eyes darted to the left, toward a faint outline of a bridge truss disappearing into mist. She watched the distant boat lights reposition, and her mouth formed silent syllables, repeating what she read from across the water. I caught only the emotion in her face: urgency, calculation, certainty. The pursuers weren't chasing blindly. They were coordinating a meet-up point, timing their approach to pin us against shallow water where our speed would die. Declan changed course again, threading us between rusted cranes and abandoned piers where the channel kinked like a question mark. The boat scraped close to a piling, and I sucked in a breath, expecting impact. But he held the line with inches to spare. I hated how impressive it was. I hated that I felt safer with him than else. In my old life, I avoided men like Declan. Tonight, I survived because he existed. Then Lila lifted her head again, eyes widening with recognition that wasn't fear. She stared toward a darker shoreline where industrial buildings hunched like sleeping animals. I'd seen those shapes in old boxes after Evan died. Photos he claimed were from work trips. Lila had studied them like stories. Now she pointed with her chin at one structure half hidden by fog, and I understood the message. Blue doors. A warehouse Evan marked as important. Declan followed her gaze without question, turning into a narrow cut between broken pilings where bigger boats would hesitate. The channel tightened, water slapping concrete walls, and fog pressed so close it felt solid. Behind us, the pursuing lights faltered, forced to slow or risk tearing their hulls open. Ahead, the warehouse loomed, its blue doors visible, and beneath them an opening at waterline level. Declan eased the boat in, and darkness swallowed us whole. Inside the warehouse, the boat slid into a hidden dock lit by thin emergency strips. A panel sealed behind us with a soft thud, and the fog stayed outside. Concrete smelled damp, but the air also carried the bite of machines kept ready. I stepped onto the slick platform, lifted Lila down, and watched her eyes widen with recognition. Somewhere a generator hummed awake. Evan had built this, and the next door would explain everything. We slid into the mouth beneath the warehouse, and the river noise vanished as if someone shut a door on Red Hook, Brooklyn. The blue doors above were only a memory now, replaced by concrete walls sweating cold. A strip of emergency lights woke along the dock, painting the water black and the air dim. The boat bumped once, soft, and Declan cut the engine. I stepped onto slick concrete, my knees weak, Lila's hand glued to mine. Behind us, metal panels moved and sealed with a thud, and the fog stayed outside. For once, no one could see us. Past the dock, a corridor opened like a throat, and warm air rolled out smelling faintly of coffee and ozone. The floor changed from raw concrete to rubber matting, then to polished steel grates that hummed underfoot. Cabinets lined the walls, all locked, all labeled in Evan's neat block letters. Monitors filled a room ahead, stacked like windows into other places, showing the warehouse exterior, the river, the streets above. A small calendar was pinned beside a keyboard, one date circled hard enough to tear the paper. Evan's handwriting turned the space into a ghost, and I felt him everywhere. I kept waiting for a punchline, for someone to tell me this was a set built for a movie. Evan had been the man who bought store-brand cereal and fixed loose cabinet hinges with a butter knife. He had kissed Leela's forehead and asked about her spelling tests, then fallen asleep on our couch with the news murmuring. Now I saw his mind in every detail. Cables coiled and tied, drives numbered, maps folded perfectly, batteries charged and stacked by size. Declan moved through the room with softness, touching nothing, but looking like it deserved respect from him. Lila drifted away from my side, not wandering, more like following a trail only she could sense. She paused at a wall of drawers and ran her fingertips over labels written in 5 different languages, as if letters had texture. In a far corner, she found a metal box bolted to a shelf, and on top of it sat an envelope, sealed with old tape. Her name was written across it in Evan's handwriting, the same slant I used to see on lunch notes. My throat closed. I had imagined Evan leaving us love, not instructions. And here was both. I let Lila open it while I watched her hands, small and steady, peel tape from paper that felt too important for my fingers. Inside was a folded sheet and a tiny card covered in symbols, accents and lines that looked like a child's doodles until you stared long enough. Lila's eyes sharpened, the way they did when she listened to strangers on the subway. She wasn't reading words so much as solving a pattern, matching shapes to sounds stored in her head. I stood behind her, smelling salt and dust, and felt grief press on my ribs all over. The sheet carried Evan's voice without sound, careful, direct, almost tender. He had mixed languages like a lock, shifting from English to Spanish to Japanese to French, then back again, as if he knew someone would be watching and needed to be left behind. Lila traced the lines with her pencil, whispering to herself without forming real sentences, just breath and recognition. When she placed the card into a slim reader beside the main console, a light changed from red to green. A drawer slid open with a quiet click, like the building exhaled, and my heart jumped with it. Inside the drawer were drives, folders, and a thick binder wrapped in plastic, all marked with the same circling date from the calendar. I flipped pages and saw streams of numbers, not random, but flowing like a river map, splitting and merging under names I recognized from headlines. There were charity boards, shipping companies, a judge's vacation home, a police union fund. Tanaka's network wasn't just men with knives and poison. It was money that bought silence, and silence that let people die quietly. Evan had drawn lines between all of it, and the lines ended near us too often. I felt sick in a different way than the boat nausea. Part of me wanted to shove the binder away and return to the version of Evan who smelled like laundry soap. Another part wanted to hold it to my chest like proof he had been trying to save us, even if he never told me. I thought of the night he died, the way his phone had vanished from the wreckage, the way strangers advised me not to ask questions. Now I understood why. He hadn't just hidden a double life. He had built an exit for his child. Declan's men checked the feeds, and I watched their faces tighten when patrol boats passed the warehouse facade without stopping, then circled back. On one screen, distant headlights swept the pier like a slow blade, searching for a boat that no longer existed. Declan studied Evan's maps with the kind of focus people reserve for scripture, and I could see something like gratitude sharpen into resolve. I hated that it made me feel proud. I hated even more that Evan's planning had become our only shelter. Lila stood between us, small shoulders straight, as if she could hold us up. The console accepted Lila's code and opened a new set of files, each one dated and timed like a heartbeat. I didn't read every page. I didn't have to. The titles alone told the story. Payoffs, shipping routes, names crossed out, names circled, and one folder marked for federal eyes only. Evan had been collecting proof, not for revenge, but for leverage, the only language syndicates understand. A small icon in the corner blinked, then turned solid, as if a message had been sent somewhere beyond our control. I felt the room shift from hiding place to trigger right now. A tone sounded, low and insistent, and the main monitor switched to the bay outside. 3 large craft were cutting through the water in formation, heavier than Tanaka's pursuit boats, moving with deliberate confidence. Their lights were official, bright and steady, and that steadiness scared me more than shadows. I had always believed uniforms meant help, until tonight taught me masks can wear badges. Declan's jaw tightened as he watched, and I could feel his people recalculating. If those boats belonged to law enforcement, they would not ask questions first. They would see him, and they would reach for cuffs. Lila leaned close to the screen, studying faces on deck through the zoom. Her expression shifted into the same certainty that had saved Declan at the Gala, and my stomach dropped, because certainty from a child never comes with comfort. Evan's hidden inheritance had not only kept us alive, it had called someone. I glanced at the folder marked for federal eyes, and understood he designed a storm to end Tanaka, even if it swept us up too. Outside, the boats closed on the warehouse entrance. Inside, we were sealed with evidence, and a man the law would arrest first. The first floodlight hit the fog like a blade, and the warehouse stopped feeling like Evan's secret and started feeling like a crime scene. Heavy boats idled outside the hidden dock, engines thumping through concrete. I pulled Lila behind my leg and tasted rusty fear as the water echoed alarms. Men and women in dark tactical gear moved with the kind of disciplined urgency you see in airport security videos. Except they were coming for us. Their boots rang on metal grates. Rifles stayed pointed low but ready. The air filled with clipped radio bursts and rotors somewhere overhead, unseen. At the front was Agent Marin Holt, face calm, eyes sharp, posture saying she had already decided who the danger was. She looked at Declan the way my old landlord looked at overdue rent. No patience, no romance, just procedure. I felt my body brace for handcuffs for Lila, too. Hands reached for evidence bags before anyone reached for explanation. Plastic ties dangled from belts like quiet threats. I kept thinking about how the system treats a single mom with the wrong address. Guilty until proven useful. Lila's fingers squeezed mine, anchoring me to breath while lights searched every corner. Declan didn't flinch, but I saw his jaw set when Holt's gaze flicked to the open files on Evan's console. The meaning landed fast. Evan had planned this handoff. He built a deadman switch, tied to a monthly code, like rent due to fate, and tonight the calendar had missed it. Somewhere in that sequence of clicks and green lights, the facility told the FBI it had been opened. Evan's evidence didn't wait for permission. It traveled automatically, like a message in a bottle with a tracking device. I understood then that Evan wasn't just hiding. He was testifying in advance. Grief hit me sideways, not as tears but as heat behind my eyes. Evan had loved us enough to build a storm set to activate after he was gone. The man who folded laundry had also folded governments. Pride rose, and shame followed, sharp as a pin in my throat. Lila watched the agents the way she watched subway crowds, not for faces but for patterns. Her eyes tracked mouths moving behind hands, glances traded, one agent recording with a phone tucked low. She didn't speak aloud. She leaned closer to me, and I felt her certainty pour into skin. On the feeds, the waterfront still crawled with shadows. Leela fixed on two figures near a pier ladder, their lips shaping Japanese coordination while their bodies played dock workers. She showed me, with a tense nod, that they were waiting for badges to distract everyone. My stomach dropped. Trap layered. Agents streamed inside with gloves, snapping photos, sliding drives into evidence bags that crinkled like dry leaves. Evan's neat labels vanished behind barcodes, and it felt like losing him again. Agent Maren Holt stayed unreadable as she scanned each item, weighing truth against fallout with cold patience in this room. I kept my arms around Leela, aware that one wrong movement could turn me from witness into problem. In Manhattan, I'd been invisible. Here I was a variable. I imagined workers, questions, paperwork that took children away while parents in hallways. I couldn't let systems swallow her when Tanaka failed. Declan stayed centered, hands visible, shoulders loose, eyes on Holt. He looked like a man about to trade something heavy without flinching. I understood the bargain without hearing it. His cooperation in exchange for Lila and me being protected, not used. I hated that my safety sounded like a transaction. Lila's focus pulled Holt toward the screens. With her stare and a tense nod, she warned that Tanaka's men still waited on the waterfront, hoping uniforms would distract everyone. I saw an agent's mouth-shaped perimeter, and bodies shifted. Holt finally registered Lila as a witness worth listening to now. Then the air changed, like thunder moving in. Radios that had been clipped and quiet spilled new urgency, place names and short codes. I felt a helicopter's thrum through the concrete, distant but growing. Techs exchanged looks, and I understood the warehouse was one spark in a fire Evan lit. Holt's team shifted into a new rhythm, coordinating outward. Evidence boxes stacked near the dock like a moving wall. Somewhere, Tanaka's people were being hit at the same time, and Evan's handwriting had become a weapon. Hope fluttered, fragile and unfamiliar, and I hated how much I needed it tonight. Declan stayed calm, but the cost showed in his eyes, tracking exits and agents. If he gave them what they wanted, he might save us and lose himself. If he refused, we could all become evidence. I pressed my lips to Lila's hair, and forced my panic to whisper only. Outside, floodlights cut the fog, turning water into silver. Inside, Evan's files moved into government hands while Tanaka's network cracked beyond my sight. I stood between Declan and Holt, between power and power, and realized survival was no longer just running. It was choosing who writes Lila's chapter from now. A corner screen flashed fresh alerts, timestamps stacking faster than my thoughts. Sirens rose and faded, replaced by rotors. Somewhere, doors Tanaka believed untouchable were opening. Holt's team pushed evidence toward the boats, and I realized Evan's plan was detonating right now, across more locations than I could imagine. When they guided us toward the dock, my hands shook so hard I feared losing Lila's grip. Holt's gaze bounced between my child and Declan, sorting threats by training. Declan didn't fight. He met my eyes with steady meaning. I followed into wet light, realizing my future decision was next. By the time the floodlights eased, the fog over Red Hook had thinned into a gray veil. Evidence bags stacked like sandbags along the dock, and gloved hands moved with tired purpose. Sealing drives, labeling binders, wiping fingerprints that were never mine. Radios still crackled, but the voices sounded farther away, as if the storm had rolled inland. Somewhere beyond the warehouse walls, helicopters drummed and then drifted off, returning from raids Evan set in motion. I could feel Tanaka's network collapsing, not with fireworks, but with doors closing. For the first time tonight, my lungs remembered how to breathe. Relief did not mean safety. It meant forms, questions, and people deciding what my daughter deserved. Agent Marin Holt kept me in her peripheral vision while her team boxed Evan's work. I saw her skepticism soften only when Lila's observations kept proving true. Still, I felt like a suspect wearing borrowed innocence. My hands shook every time someone said the word relocation, because I pictured our tiny apartment, the chipped mug Evan loved, the school art on the fridge. Normal life was not waiting for us. It was already gone. Even the quiet between sirens felt temporary, like time again. Declan Cross stood apart from the agents, wrists unbound but future already measured. I watched him make a decision that looked simple, only because he had practiced hard choices for years. He offered cooperation in a narrow, strategic way, enough to lock Tanaka into cages, enough to protect me and Lila, but not enough to pretend he was suddenly clean. I understood, without hearing details, that the price would be his freedom for a while. He did it anyway, and I hated that it steadied me. In that moment, he stopped being a rumor and became a shield with consequences. My feelings about Declan stayed messy. I did not forgive the violence his world required, and I did not like that he had watched my life from a distance. But when I replayed the night, I kept seeing one thing: him stepping between danger and my child, again and again, without asking permission. Gratitude landed like a bruise, tender and unwelcome. I was angry at Evan for secrets, angry at Declan for power, angry at myself for needing either. Yet my arms tightened around Lila, and I let myself accept protection. Not because I trusted him, but I trusted her. Holt's offer came wrapped in rules, not comfort. New addresses, new routines, new silence. She made it clear that witnesses do not get to negotiate with risk. They get to be moved like fragile evidence. I nodded while my stomach sank, imagining Lila starting over, learning teachers' names, pretending she had always lived somewhere else. I imagined myself working another job, another uniform, another set of invisible rules. Holt's system was not kind, but it was a path. I realized I could keep my pride, or I could keep my daughter safe. So I chose one that hurt, and lived. When the agents finally let me breathe in a quieter corner, I crouched beside Lila and watched her face. She looked exhausted, but her eyes kept scanning, reading truth the way other kids read picture books. I understood then that her gift was never just languages. It was perception, pattern, the ability to notice what adults hide behind manners. Evan had given her that mind, and the world had made it dangerous. I touched her hair and promised myself I would stop treating her difference like a secret shame. We would learn how to live with it, safely from now. I used to think strength meant doing everything alone and never letting anyone see you sweat. That belief kept me upright after Evan died, but it also made me brittle. Tonight proved something else. Strength was the way I moved when Lila ran, the way I kept my body between her and strangers, the way I admitted fear and still took the next step. Love was not a feeling I could save for later. Love was motion, in real time, with shaking hands. If my pride had to crack so she could breathe, then let it crack right in public. As dawn brightened, the city looked ordinary again, which felt almost insulting. A coffee cart opened somewhere above the pier. A gull circled like nothing had happened. Holt's people guided us toward a waiting vehicle, and I carried a small bag of essentials that did not include my old life. Lila leaned into my side, trusting my direction even when I had none. Declan watched from a distance, surrounded by agents, and I felt the weight of what he was giving up. I didn't know if I would ever see him again. I only knew I owed him honesty later. Later, when Lila slept, I looked at my shaking hands and learned my lesson. Love is what you do, not what you brag about. Evan's secrets cut me, but they also carried us. Declan's protection came with consequences, but it kept my child breathing. My pride used to feel like strength. Now it feels like a wall I can lower. Here's my question for you. If someone hid the truth to keep you safe, would you forgive them? Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. If you want this, like and subscribe, then share.